Let's go to the slideshow for the evening. Are there any questions while I'm setting that up?
I have a question about what Powell said. He said that the money supply doesn't affect inflation.
Who said that? Oh,
Powell.
Powell. The money supply doesn't affect inflation, right? Okay.
So then, what is the definition of inflation? Isn't that increasing the increase of the money supply or something of that nature?
Hold on a second. I'm working on a different computer tonight, so I'm just sort of organizing my screen. In terms of the money supply and whether or not it's inflationary, what we've learned is that increasing the money supply doesn't have to be inflationary at all. And why is that? Because we've seen since 2008 enormous rounds of Federal Reserve support and federal government support in terms of stimulus spending and zero interest rates and all sorts of quantitative easing since 2008 that have added trillions of dollars to the overall debt of the country, but have exhibited almost no inflation over the course of the last 13 years. It's important to remember that ever since China entered the WTO in the early 2000s and really became a global force in trade, the traditional relationship that exists between unemployment and inflation has disintegrated. What are we talking about here? The Phillips curve that shows the inverse relationship between unemployment and inflation, that if unemployment goes down, inflation has to go up. And unemployment went to 14% during the Great Recession and went back down to 3.5% by January 2017, and we experienced zero inflation. So it's a long answer to a short question, but it's a good illustration of what Jerome Powell was talking about, is that we've learned that expanding the money supply does not need to be inflationary. Remember what he said, it's the slump when we need to be spending. It's not when the economy is expanding that we need to be spending. And so I think that's what he was referring to. Is that okay there, Andrew?
Yeah, I guess so. I mean, the thing is, like, I thought when
ample evidence that expanding the money supply doesn't need to be inflationary.
Yeah.
That's the answer.
So I was gonna say that when we were expanding, like when we were in expansion, we were still spending a lot too, weren't we?
You're talking about when we were expanding after the Great
When we
Recession?
had an expansion, we were still spending a lot. So it wasn't really. So we didn't really slow down after the slumps, no. So you were saying that during the slumps, according to Keynesian, we spend a lot. During the expansion, we slow down. But
During expansion, the idea is that the Federal Reserve should be less active, should be less aggressive, and we don't need as much federal fiscal support as we do during a time of contraction. Right now, we have extraordinary fiscal and monetary support coming from the federal government and from the Federal Reserve that is helping to prop up the economy and encourage what could be a boom over the course of the next 2 years. We saw the same thing after the Great Recession, a combination of monetary and fiscal policy action that has continued to support the economy. As it turns out, the Federal Reserve after the Great Recession by the time they became ready to raise interest rates, we have a new problem on our hands, and that problem was the coronavirus. And so the Fed was pushed back into the position of having to drive rates back to near zero, which is where we find ourselves now on the heels of what was a seismic event, a black swan event. We lost 22 million, 23 million jobs in a period of a couple of months, and we saw the second quarter of last year contract by an annual rate of more than a third. So the old rules don't apply. In other words, as I said, the deconstruction of the Phillips curve is the theory behind the Phillips curve, that inverse relationship that no longer exists between unemployment and inflation. And so the Federal Reserve can take an expansionary position without worrying about causing inflation. And all the arguments that were made in 2008 that you can't rescue the economy, you can't rescue the you can't rescue the banks and you can't rescue the auto industry, because if you do that, in addition to the $760+ billion rescue package under Obama, that's going to lead to what? That's going to lead to enormous inflation, none of which ever happened. So let's turn our attention to the labor numbers from last week. I wanted to. Okay, can somebody mute their mic? So let's take a look at the labor numbers from last week. What did we see? We saw again an extraordinary number for the week ending April 3rd. We saw initial jobless claims at 744,000. So a little over, so 24,000 more, excuse me, a little less than 20,000 more than we saw the week before. What was the headline? How do I mute that? Can someone tell me where is the button to mute everybody? Here we go. Can I get an answer from somebody?
I'm not sure on that one.
Right, I know you can hear me, but where is the button to mute everybody? Somebody's. Okay, so let's do that. Okay, so what was the headline? Jobless claims rise again. Labor market continues. Labor stress continues. Obviously, these are extraordinary numbers, but UI claims are expected to trend lower as the economy reopens and more people are vaccinated. We've been talking about that now for weeks and weeks, all of which supports the position of the Biden administration, along with the Federal Reserve, that expects that the continued marriage of monetary and fiscal policy action, along with the successful vaccination program, is going to lead to significant economic growth in the third and fourth quarter of this year, continuing on into 2022 and 23. If you take a look at the numbers on the top of the page here, what do we see? We see the yield curve as it closed out today. And what do we see on the spread between the 2 and the 10-year? We see that it's holding steady at 154 basis points. So we haven't seen a precipitous rise in the yield on the 10-year. The 2-year has basically stayed within a range over the course of the last 4 months. But clearly, coordinated federal bank action around the world is acting to keep rates lower than they might otherwise be in the absence of that. We're going to continue to keep an eye on Treasury spreads over the course of the next couple of weeks. So in terms of a review of what we talked about last week, we talked about domestic production subsidies, which were granted to import competing producers to encourage output and vitality. We know that it provides a significant cost advantage, which allows producers to sell their products at lower prices. And we identified the different forms that subsidies can appear as, either as direct cash payments, tax breaks, insurance, or subsidized loan. In terms of the welfare effects, we said that the welfare effects of a domestic subsidy are increased producer surplus, right, as a result of the higher prices that accrue to more efficient U.S. producers, and the protective effect as more expensive output is being sold domestically. That protective effect is what represents the deadweight welfare loss. The key about subsidies is what? Is that there's no change in consumption. There's no consumption effect that we would see under a tariff or a quota, because the subsidy doesn't distort consumer choices the way that a tariff or a quota does. We said again, it's a lower cost to the nation, subsidies are, than an equivalent tariff and a quota, because tariffs and quotas distort consumer choices, which trigger what? Inefficient domestic production, because you're closing out foreign competition, which leads to lower imports and a loss of consumer surplus. If there are any questions as we move through this review, please let me know. We then talked about export subsidies that allow firms to sell their goods overseas at below cost or below their profit targets. The thing with export subsidies is what? Is that if you're a domestic producer who's benefiting from an export subsidy, that means that with regard to the domestic market, you're unwilling to sell at a price lower than you can achieve by selling product overseas. So that represents a direct welfare loss for domestic consumers. So you'll have higher output and prices for exporters, but you have lower domestic consumption at home because of the higher prices, which represents a welfare loss. So the welfare effects we identified last week as your increased producer surplus, your decreased consumer surplus, again pointing out that domestic consumers gain at the expense of domestic consumers and taxpayers because, as we know, subsidies are not free goods. Somebody has to pay for them. So it's the taxpayer that pays for them as the government tries to give a competitive advantage to domestic producers. So we looked here at the welfare effect of a subsidy, and we showed very easily that we showed that the steel industry was able to achieve a $25 a ton subsidy on every ton of steel that is sold, and on every ton of steel that is sold by an American company. That raises the overall price from $400 to $425, meaning the end price, the after price, the after subsidy price to the producer is the $400 plus the $25, which is the consumer price paid plus the subsidy itself. He said that as a result of the subsidy, domestic production is going to increase from 2 million units, 2 million tons to 7 million tons, which represents the protective effect, which is the deadweight welfare loss that the nation undergoes. The cost of the subsidy is the number of units that are sold, the number of units that are produced in the US and then sold. That's 7 million units here multiplied by the 25 gave us the $175 million, which is the cost. And we saw that overall imports shrank from 12 million tons to 7 million tons as the result of the subsidy, giving more efficient domestic producers the opportunity to bump up domestic production while achieving a greater profit on their sales. Are there any questions on domestic production subsidy here before I move on?
Yes, Professor. So can we say that the only deadweight loss that the nation incurred will be the area B only?
I'm sorry? The deadweight welfare loss is represented by area B. That's the deadweight welfare loss here, is the protective effect.
Okay, thank you.
There's producer surplus and the deadweight welfare loss, the protector effect. There's no consumption effect. Typically, we say that it's the protective effect and the consumption effect that make up our deadweight welfare losses. But the key here with the subsidy is there's no change in consumption. Because remember, the subsidy doesn't distort consumer choices like the quota does or the tariff does. Does that help?
Yes, thank you.
Perfect. You're welcome. So let's move on then in our review. And we looked at, again, export subsidies. And let's walk through this quickly. We showed that at autarky, the nation was selling at $4 a unit, was selling cars. We're talking about wheat. We're talking about bushels of wheat. So at autarky, the price was $4 a bushel. The world price, once trade begins, the world price is $5 a bushel. What happened when trade begins? When trade begins, domestic production falls and imports increase. Domestic production falls from 6 to 4 million units, and overall imports go from 0 to 4 million units, right? And overall consumption goes from 6 million units to 8 million units of wheat, or 6 million bushels of wheat, excuse me. Then as a result of the export subsidy, what happens? The dollar export subsidy on every bushel of wheat means that you as a domestic producer can earn $6 a bushel as opposed to $5 a bushel domestically. That means that you're going to increase your production and sell as much as you can overseas because you can make $1 more on every bushel. Well, that's great for domestic producers and domestic for competing labor, import competing producers, but not so good for domestic consumers. So we went along, we plotted the welfare effects of the export subsidy. We said that A plus B, which is the area below the demand curve and above the price, represents what? Your lost consumer surplus. You have A plus B plus C, which was your increasing producer surplus, which represents the area above the supply curve and below the price between 5 and 6. And then what's the cost to the taxpayers? Well, your imports went from 0 to 4 million to 8 million bushels of wheat. Well, those exports of 8 million bushels of wheat, it's $8 million times the cost of the subsidy, which is the cost is the per unit subsidy, which is $1, that gets you to $8 million. The deadweight welfare loss, much like the question before that Fawazah had, under subsidy, we just have the protective effect here. We see we have the protective effect, and we also have the consumption effect here with the export subsidy that leads to a deadweight welfare loss of $2 million. As what happens under the export subsidy? Domestic production falls from 4 million bushels to 2 million bushels, and overall exports increase, overall supply increases from 8 million units to 10 million units. Any questions here? I'm in Florida, where it's very hot, which is why I am super warm. I'm traveling for some work this week, so forgive me for the heat, although I realize none of you have to worry about that. Okay, so let's move on. So we talked about international price discrimination, which is one of the earlier questions in the class tonight. We said that that producers can discriminate between different elasticities demand in different countries. So it can sell at a higher price in a less elastic market, let's say its home market, and a lower price in a market where the demand is where the market is more elastic. They can sell in a more competitive marketplace. And what we'll discuss tonight is how really what an international price discrimination allows companies to do is to sell at below their average total cost, but above their variable cost to achieve optimal returns. One of the points that we brought up last week was that differences in logistics costs, transportation costs, and trade restrictions make it easier to distinguish between international markets versus local markets or domestic markets. Okay. It's easier to sell products at different prices between the US and Europe than, let's say, New York and California is one way to think about it. Okay. Any questions here on IPD? We're going to do some examples tonight. If there isn't anything, we're going to move on to some new material. Okay, so well then, before we get to the new material, let's take a quick review here of the example we looked at with international price discrimination last week. We said that that the company maximizes its profits selling steel where its marginal revenue equals, where its marginal revenue equals its marginal cost here. All we had to do was draw a horizontal line up, straight to intercept the demand curve to know we're selling exactly 45 tons at $500 a ton. All we need to do now as a non-price discriminating seller is we need to draw a horizontal line at $500 a unit directly across to intersect the demand curve to identify what the quantity sold and at what price level we're going to be in each one of the sub-markets. So in South Korea, we'll sell at $500 a ton, 35 tons of steel, and we'll sell $500 a ton, we'll send 10 tons of steel in Canada at $500 a ton. So we added all up that together, and what did we came up with? We came up with a profit of $22,500 less the $13,500, which how do we get that? The average total cost, which was $300 times the 45 tons of steel, gave us a cost of $13,500, subtracted from our revenue, gives us a profit of $9,000. Are there any questions on this, on how we identify the various market levels of quantity and price as a non-discriminating seller? No? Okay, so now we took a look at, well, as a price discriminating seller, we know that the company is going to maximize profit by charging a higher price in a less elastic market. The optimal price is found when the horizontal lines can intersect the marginal revenue schedule in each one of the markets, each one of the sub-markets, as you can see here. So at $200 a ton, we intersect in Canada here at the marginal revenue schedule, and we draw a vertical line straight up to intersect the demand curve, which gets us to $400 a unit. So we're selling 20 tons at $400 units in Canada as a price discriminating seller, and we're going to sell here at $200 a ton, which is our average total cost. We've intersected our marginal revenue curve. We draw a line straight up to go to our demand curve. We're going to sell 25 tons at $700 a ton in South Korea. And so adding all of that up, we get revenue of $17,500 and $8,000 in the two sub-markets, which gives us $25,500 less the same cost we had as a non-discriminating seller, gave us an additional profit of $3,000. So we're able to generate an additional $3,000 worth of profit by taking advantage of differences in price elasticities of demand between the South Korean and the Canadian market. Are there any questions on this?
Yes, Professor, there is
Hey, Zohar, what's up?
Ray, there is any international law that defends consumer from price discrimination?
I can't hear you. Pardon me?
I'm asking if there is any international law that defend the customers.
There
against
is.
Price.
You're talking about, is there any law that protects against price gouging? Yes, there is. There is law that protects against price gouging. Absolutely. And we're going to talk about that. There are systems.
So how sellers can avoid breaking the law, and at the same time they can use their advantage in price discrimination?
Well, so there are a variety of, the technique is based on knowing what the laws are in each country. In the United States, there's a fair market value. The fair market value is based upon a price plus an 8% profit margin. We're going to talk about that in a couple of slides. But you're right, there is a mechanism in place to determine what is a fair market value. And there are mechanisms in place within the World Trade Organization and within the Department of Commerce here in the United States to determine whether or not a country is, the US or any other country, is unfairly selling products at predatory prices in any particular market. And there are fines that can be assessed either by the World Trade Organization or here in the US that are imposed by the Department of Commerce or the International Trade Commission that can assess duties or penalties if countries or companies try to illegally dump their products. So there are mechanisms in place to prevent against illegal dumping. So if we talk about dumping, we know that there are different forms of international price discrimination, which occurs when that occurs when foreign buyers are charged lower price than domestic buyers, or when companies sell in foreign markets below their production costs. So there are three different types of dumping. There's sporadic dumping, which is a type of distress dumping when a firm sells excess inventories in foreign markets at lower than domestic prices. It's typically due to unexpected changes in supply and demand conditions. You built 1 million units for the widget that you sell, and you can only sell 700,000 widgets in your domestic market. Well, now you have an opportunity to sell the balance, your 300,000 widgets, in some offshore market, some overseas market, but at a price lower than what you sell at home because the market abroad is more competitive. It's more elastic. And so this is an example of distress dumping. There's predatory dumping, where companies try to underprice their competitors to gain a monopoly position or to put somebody out of business. Sam Walton of Walmart was famous, or rather infamous, for when he first started his Walmart 5 and dime store many years ago in the 1940s, back there in Bentonville, Arkansas. What he would do was, you'd have a Woolworths or a 5 and dime store on one corner, and he would open a Walmart on all 3 other corners, or on 2 corners. and he would undersell whatever the Woolworth or Five and Dime store was selling by 30, 40, 50%. The laws that are in place today to prevent that type of dumping were not in place back in the 1940s and 50s, and that allowed Walmart to gain enormous competitive advantage in markets where it was first opening. That, of course, has led to the juggernaut that Walmart is today, with tens of thousands of outlets around the world. So again, predatory dumping is used to develop a monopoly position where the producer is temporarily reducing prices charged abroad to drive producers out of business. Pardon me. Persistent dumping goes on indefinitely, where the producer is consistently selling goods abroad at a price that is less than the home market price using international price discrimination, exactly as we talked about. And the margin of dumping is the difference between whatever the domestic price is and the foreign market price. That's your margin of dumping. So getting back to Sahara's question, we talk about how are anti-dumping duties assessed. Well, here in the United States, they're administered by the U.S. Department of Commerce, and they're levied when foreign goods are sold here in the U.S. at less than fair market value or less than fair value, right? What does that equate to? Well, it's the average total cost plus an 8% profit margin. So the fair market value is determined by the Department of Commerce using two types of methodologies. It uses the price-based definition and it uses the cost-based definition. So under the price-based definition, if the home nation price is unavailable, France is selling a product in the US and we can't get the price for the product that France is selling in the US that we think they may be dumping in France. So we have to look at a third market to assess the price. That's called the price. That's what the price-based methodology uses. The cost-based definition determines a fair market value based upon four components: the cost of manufacturing the merchandise, the cost of general expenses, the cost of packing the merchandise, and whatever the profit is on home market sales. As I pointed out before, we know that average variable cost is more accurate than average total cost. And that as long as the firm can cover if it's average variable costs, dumping allows the company to contribute to if it's average total cost, right? Even though the price is less than the average total cost. Now, the U.S. International Trade Commission is another U.S. agency like the Department of Commerce that determines when imports threaten domestic industry, and they impose anti-dumping duties with tariffs to neutralize any price discrimination effects where a nation, my example was France, was selling at below cost sales. Are there any questions here? The methodology for applying dumping duties here in the United States is pretty straightforward, as you can see. Let's take a look at an example here. We see that here, the company is selling 100 units at home at $300 a unit for sales revenue of $30,000, right? They're not selling anything abroad. So if the variable cost is $200 a unit, that's your $20,000. That leaves you $10,000. If your fixed costs are $10,000, your profit is nothing. So without dumping, the firm has achieved basic break even. It hasn't earned money, it hasn't lost any money. But what if we know that the company, by only producing 300 units, has excess capacity to produce another 50 units, right? So it could sell 100 units at home at $300 a unit and 50 units abroad at $250 a unit for a total, as you see here, of $42,500. Now, the variable cost per unit stay the same at 200 per unit. Well, now it's 200 times 150 as opposed to 100, gets you to 30,000. Well, you've generated now more revenue here. It's 12,500 less your variable costs. Your fixed costs have stayed the same. Your profit's now $2,500 a unit, right? So while the domestic demand price is inelastic and doesn't change much with price, the foreign price is more elastic, it's more competitive, so the company can't charge more than the $250 a unit for the 50 additional units that it's able to produce. right? So it's dumping 50 units abroad at a price of $250. So the producer is dumping those radios at prices below the home market price. It's dumping them at $250 a unit. As long as it's covering its average variable costs of $200 a unit, which it is at $250 a unit, well, everything else above that contributes to its average total cost of $10,000. So any price which contributes to its fixed cost permits larger profits than are realized with any type of idle plant capacity. So here, what do we see? That with dumping, the company can sell it less than its average total cost here of $267, but greater than its average variable cost, which allows it to realize greater profits than it might otherwise by only selling in the domestic market. So we see here that with dumping, the firm can increase its profits by selling at an average total cost that is at a price less than the average total cost of $267, which I said here. Okay, selling above its average variable cost, but less than its average total cost. Any questions on that? The key takeaway here is that what drives price discrimination is where you are in your average variable costs. If you can cover those and you can sell at a lower price in another market, if you can sell at a higher price, great. But presuming that it's a more competitive market, you're going to sell at a lower price. It might be a lower price, but as long as you can cover your variable costs, that's fine. It's going to contribute to your bottom line. That's the takeaway here. Are there any questions?
Yes, Professor. So the average
Sure, sir.
Average total cost always changing because of the change between the ratio of the dumping and the non-dumping products, right?
That's right. And of course, on an example, if in an exam, I would give you the average variable cost and the total fixed costs. But yes, average variable cost change. As long as you can cover them, as long as you can still be selling below your average total cost per unit, it doesn't matter. That's why dumping makes sense, as long as you're not breaking any international or domestic laws. So
Wait, I got a question, Professor. So in the foreign market, the fair price is $250, or are they selling below?
In the foreign market, the fair price is $250. In the foreign market, they can sell at $250. At home, I can sell for $300 a unit, but abroad, it's a more competitive market. I can only sell at $250. But I've reached my saturation in my domestic market, 100 units at $300 a unit. But I still have extra capacity. Well, I can monetize that in a foreign market at $250 a unit. It's not as much as my total cost, but just above my variable cost, which allows me to book more profit. That's the answer.
Professor,
So, pardon me?
Professor, how would we identify how many units we can export?
Above what you export, what you produce at home?
Mm-hmm.
I would have to tell you that in an exam. You'd have to be told that. I'm telling you here that the company has excess capacity of 50 units.
All right.
Okay.
But like in a real life or in a real life example, how will they identify that they can exceed a certain amount of units?
I'm selling a widget in the US at $300 a unit. I know I can sell it in the US market. I can sell it. I know that I've done market research. I know that I can't sell that product in Europe at $300 a unit. I know that I can sell it at $250 a unit. Well, I know I can only produce another 50 units given my existing resources. I'm going to sell it in Europe at $250 a unit based upon my market research.
Okay, thank you.
That's right. That's right.
I have a question too.
Sure.
So on an exam, we will be given the excess capacity, variable, and fixed costs. We just have to determine that.
Hey, Nicole, that's exactly right. I would give you that on an exam. That's not going to be on your quiz on Thursday, but yes, I would on an exam. Good question. Thank you.
Thank you.
So here, what do we see? We see again, it's another graphic illustration of the principle that we just talked about. So we show that as long as your average variable costs are covered, any price that contributes to your fixed costs is going to permit larger profits than you realize if your plant is just sitting there, right? So your break-even point here is where your marginal cost equals your average total cost. Yes? Your marginal cost equals your average total cost. But here, what do we say? The firm can increase its profit at a price less than average total cost, where your price is less than average total cost, but as we said in the previous slide, greater than average variable cost. This is just another way of saying the same thing we said in the previous slide, but gives you a nice graph, a nice graphic here that I wanted you to see. So let's take a look at an example of an interesting case that happened in Canada a couple of years ago. We saw that in the late 1980s, we had extensive tree planting in the United States that led to record harvests and oversupply that vastly exceeded storage capacity. So what happened? Washington producers cut Canadian prices significantly. So Washington producers overproduced and they dumped their apples on the Canadian market. And in 1989, Canada ruled that Washington growers had dumped their apples on the Canadian market and they hurt Canadian apple growers. And they imposed 5-year duties, 5 years worth of duties, penalties on Washington apple growers. They established a fair value, a fair market value for a standard 42-pound box of apples of $11.87 a box. Why do we care that? Because we care about that because we care about the mechanics. So under current rules, we talked about, under the Department of Commerce, we talked about how when goods are being sold at less than fair market value, which is equated with average total cost plus an 8% profit margin. So it's the same thing here. There's an allowance for 8% of profit. So we see that this is the normal value in dollars was the harvesting cost, your packing cost, which gives you total cost of $10.99 for a 42-pound box. Here is your 8% margin that was established under that the Canadian courts decided. That came with a fair value of $11.87 for a 42-pound box. Now the margin of dumping by Washington apple growers range from 0 to 64%. The weighted average margin of dumping was a price greater than the fair value of $11.87 of just about 33%. Okay, and so anyway, there were severe penalties imposed on Washington apple growers, and that was a result of their illegal dumping of apples at a gross profit margin for Washington apple growers that was cited by the Canadian courts. Naturally, when dumping accusations occur between WTO members, there is a case that's brought before the WTO. Certainly, we've talked about Airbus and Boeing and the ongoing arguments between the major aeronautics companies that exist. Who else is there? There's Boeing, there's Airbus, and who's the other one out of Canada? Who are the major aerospace companies? Boeing, Airbus,
SpaceX,
Bombardier. So you have three major companies that control the aerospace market. What is that called in economic terms? It's not a monopoly.
Oligopoly?
Yeah, I'm monopoly.
It's an
Oligopoly?
oligopoly. Thank you, Andrew.
Wait,
That's exactly right.
Isn't I've got the one that's based in America. I think it's not Airbus, it's the other one. Yeah, Boeing.
Boeing.
Isn't Boeing subsidized by the government?
Yes, Boeing is subsidized by the government. Boeing is given, the government pays for research that it passes on to Boeing, and Boeing then subcontracts out to Japanese and Chinese manufacturers who they themselves are subsidized by their governments.
Okay.
This is an accusation of Airbus. Airbus also, which is the European conglomerate, the European aerospace conglomerate, they receive very generous subsidies from Europe. And so there have been ongoing fights or arguments. I don't want to use the word fight or arguments, disagreements. Cases that have been brought in the World Trade Organization where one accuses the other of unfair competitive advantages, and there have been penalties assessed over the years. Most recently, there was a case last November 2020, where the World Trade Organization said that that Boeing had unfairly benefited from U.S. unfair competitive assistance from the United States, unfair subsidies, and that the European Union had the right to impose billions of dollars worth of penalties on the United States. That was just November 2020. Okay, so moving on, we talk about other types of non-tariff barriers and other types of government procurement policies. So in 1930, we have the Buy American Act of 1930 that established U.S. suppliers of federal agencies are given preference over foreign suppliers. You would think that the U.S. government or the French government or the Mexican government would want to favor their domestic producers over foreign suppliers. That's perfectly reasonable. And what was it meant to do originally back in the 1930s was meant to stimulate job growth during the Great Depression, just the way the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act of the 1933 was meant to protect domestic farmers. One of them was reasonably successful, the Buy American Act of 1933, which stands as opposed to the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act, which was, as you know, a complete disaster. But moving forward, we know that federal agencies purchase material products from U.S. suppliers if the prices are not unreasonably higher than foreign producers. And one of you is going to ask me, because you're all very smart, well, what is considered unreasonably higher? That's a very amorphous, very vague term. Well, there's very specific designation for what is the term, what's considered to be unreasonably higher. Well, the first thing is that a minimum of 50% of the manufactured content has to 50% of the content has to be manufactured domestically in order to be considered a domestic product. Okay, that's the first thing. Pardon me. Next, U.S. suppliers are given a 6% preference margin, and they receive the bid as long as the U.S. bid, the lowest U.S. bid is not greater than 6% higher than the competing foreign bid. It's a 6% preference margin. The preference margin rises to 12% if the bid happens to be located in a labor surplus area. What's a labor surplus area? Any region of the country where the unemployment rate is higher than the existing national unemployment rate by a margin of 5% for 2 consecutive months. And finally, the preference margin rises to 50% if the purchase is made by the Department of Defense. So there's enormous concessions afforded to the Department of Defense and to military equipment with regard to buying the products that are needed to maintain the U.S. military. Finally, the preference margins are all waived if the U.S. produced good is not available in sufficient qualities or insufficient quality or satisfactory quality. Are there any questions on that? In other words, preferences are given to U.S. made products that are at least 50% manufactured in the United States with an increasing ladder of preference margins from 6% to 12% to 50%, depending upon what the condition is. Okay? Okay. And finally, we talk about social regulations that correct undesirable side effects that the markets might ignore. Things having to do with health, safety, and the environment. We've talked about things like OSHA and the EPA. So we have things like the fuel efficiency standards that were established here in the United States in 1975. We have the CAFE standards, which are corporate average fuel economy standards that set passenger car standards at 27.5 miles per gallon. And finally, things like bans on hormone-treated meat. Those are social regulations that are meant to improve the health, safety, and environment of the citizens of the country. Are there any questions on that? No? Okay, good. Let's talk about the homework assignment, okay? Let's talk about questions 15, 16, 17, and 18 in chapter 5. As I said, the rest of the questions are posted for you. The answers to the rest of the questions are posted for you on Blackboard. I'm not going to test you on domestic content requirement on Wednesday. I will test you on quotas and subsidies. I will test you on quotas and subsidies, okay? And international price discrimination on Wednesday's quiz. You're going to get the procedure for the quiz is going to be the same as the procedure for the midterm in terms of you're going to get a confirmation Wednesday morning that we're on track for a start time of 7:30. We're not going to have class on Wednesday night. You're going to have 60 minutes for the quiz, and that'll be that. I'll post the grades at the end of the week. We will return to class on Monday, and we're going to start in Chapter 8 on regional trading relationships. But let's focus now on questions 16, 17, and 18 in detail. And if any questions come up, let's go through them thoroughly so everyone feels prepared for Thursday's exam, for Wednesday's exam, pardon me. So the first question that we're looking at, chapter number 16, we have the supply and demand schedule for Venezuela. Excuse me. Up here on the right, you see the supply and demand schedule for Venezuela. Yes? For TV sets in Venezuela. And all we need to do at first is we need to plot the demand and supply schedules for television sets in Venezuela. So as you can see, I'm plotting them at each level, corresponding to the upper right-hand corner, plotting each data point that we've given, quantity demanded, quantity supplied, so that we can then draw a line for the demand of Venezuela and the demand and the supply of Venezuela. So the first question is to draw the supply and demand schedules. We've done that. We know that Venezuela is a small nation and can't affect world prices, that they're going to import TV sets at $150 a set. The question is how many TVs does Venezuela produce, consume, and import? Well, if Venezuela imports at $150 each, also quantify consumer producer surpluses, well, there's the free trade price of $150. That means that under free trade, the quantity supplied is 100, demanded is 800, and imports are 700. Next, we say, well, what's the consumer surplus? Well, based upon the supply and demand curves and the free trade equilibrium price, we have the consumer surplus here. We can quantify as 160,000, calculated as you see here, right? And we have the producer surplus there, which is calculated as 2,500. The area above the supply curve and below the price, you see there is your producer surplus. Now assume that Venezuela imposes a quota that limits imports to 300 TV sets. Determine the quota-induced price, increase and decrease in consumer surplus. Calculate the quotas through distributed, protective, revenue, and consumption effects. That's like an exam question I would give to you. So let's look.
Professor, I have a question.
Hey, Nicole.
Yes. How do you get the 550 over there? I'm confused in there because the 550 price.
All we did was we plotted every point, right? We plotted the points and we draw a line. If you drew your graph correctly, that line is going to go right through at 550 here. That's your y-intercept, okay? That's your y-intercept that borders your demand curve, okay?
Should we calculate the line equation and then find 550?
No, the way to solve the problem is to take the demand and supply schedule, plot it just the way you see me plotting it here, and draw your lines on the graph, and it comes out exactly perfectly. And then you're told that at $150 a unit, what's the free trade quantity supplied, quantity demanded, and imports, and that's all quite simple. You intersect the demand and supply curve as you see here, which gives us our 100 units produced, 800 units demanded, and 700 imported, which leads us to A and to B. Now we're told that we have a quota limiting TV imports to 300 sets, we're told to determine the quota-induced price increase and decrease in consumer surplus and calculate the following welfare effects. So what do we know? We know that the domestic supply is going to be whatever the existing domestic production is plus the quota. So we have 100 plus 300 gives us 400, which is where you see this circle drawn here. We then draw a line parallel to the existing supply curve. So we have our quota-induced supply curve or quota-adjusted supply curve. From there, we're able to draw a line straight across, gets us to our quota-induced price, which is exactly 250. Pardon me. From there, we see where does that line intersect the supply curve, the existing supply curve, and the quota-adjusted supply curve. Yes? So we're able to identify the redistributive effect, which is here, 20,000. Your protective effect, because your domestic production is increased from 100 units to 300 units. 300 units plus the 300 unit production, domestic production, plus the 300 unit quota gives you your 600 units, right? This gives you your revenue effect, which is your 300 units times the 100, gives you 30,000. And then you have your consumption effect, because overall consumption has shrunk from 800 to 600, yes? And so that's your consumption effect as a result of the quota, which equals 10,000. Next, we say, what's your overall welfare loss? Your overall welfare loss is your protective effect, your revenue effect, and your consumption effect, which equals B plus C plus D gives you 50,000. And that's the answer. Now, Venezuela grants import competing producers a subsidy of $100 a TV set. Well, if it's $100 a TV set, what's the end price to the producer going to be if the free trade price is $150? The end price to the producer is going to be the domestic price of $150 plus the subsidy. What is that?
250.
Thank you, Sahar. That's exactly right. It's 250. So that means that the subsidy-induced price is same as the quota-induced price, right? What's the difference here is that you're not going to see any change in what? You're not going to see any change in consumption. You see, the quantity supplied increases from 100 to 300. The quantity demanded stays at 800, and the imports are at 500. What we saw before was, of course, under the quota, overall demand falls from 800 to 600. Yes, domestic production increases to 300 and overall consumption is 600. So what we see is that the subsidy of $100 puts the country in exactly the same position as it was under the quota. There's a key difference, though, is that the subsidy cost was your 300 TV sets that's produced domestically plus the times the 100 gives you 30,000. The producer surplus there, and then of course your protective effect, which is the 10,000, and that's it. Your welfare loss is your protective effect, and that's the whole thing. Okay, which of course is very different than what we saw under the quota, where there were much more significant welfare effects, because the quota distorts consumer choices and distorts the market much more strongly than the subsidy does. Okay, so. Any questions here?
So in the subsidy, the consumer doesn't get affected.
The consumer doesn't get affected because the subsidy is going directly to the producer. The price hasn't changed. The price didn't go from 150 to 250. The price is still 150, but the producer is getting another $100 in every TV set. You understand? The price to you, the consumer, stays the same. It doesn't go up as it did under the quota.
Oh,
The
Professor.
subsidy is like an incentive for the producer, right?
That's exactly right. The subsidy is a cash incentive for the producer. In this case, it's not a tax break, it's a subsidy.
Got it.
It's a direct cash payment. It's a direct cash payment.
Oh, Professor, the amount of subsidies a government can give is limited by the amount of money they have, but a quota, it is not. They could put a quota on everything, I guess. So like the only setback for having a subsidy is the amount of money they have. Is that correct?
Well, the subsidy you can always raise money for a subsidy. I mean,
If you raise taxes, but like
if you raise taxes, that's what I was looking for, an artful way to say. Yes, if you raise taxes, or if you utilize the Federal Reserve to
You're printing
print money, of course that's possible. In the case of the United States, well, that's exactly right. Subsidies are not free goods; they have to be paid somewhere. That's going to come from out of taxes. In terms of quota, it really depends upon how you look at it. The U.S. can impose a quota, but the costs are very significant, much as we saw with the tariffs that were imposed under the Trump administration with regard to the steel coming out of Canada, or the lumber that's coming out of Canada, or and the terrible results that have the results that have happened, whether it was the collapse of the soybean market here in the United States, the impact on the agricultural sector, or the home builder pushback that we're getting now because of soaring timber prices. So let's move on then in our remaining 15 minutes and see if we can get through our next two questions. So here we have in chapter 5, question number 17, we have the computer supply and demand in Ecuador. And if you look at the right, I've reproduced for you the exact same chart, supply and demand schedule we got in the textbook. And what we're going to do now is we're going to plot exactly what we see there, okay? As you can see on each slide, each successive slide, I'm highlighting what I'm plotting. On the right, I'm highlighting, and on the left, I'm plotting on the graph. And what are we going to do when we've plotted all of our numbers? We're going to draw our lines, our supply curve for Ecuador and our demand curve for Ecuador. Now, we're told that Hong Kong and Taiwan can supply computers to Ecuador at $300 and $500 respectively. The first thing you should tell yourself is what? Who is Ecuador going to buy TVs from?
Hong
The
Kong.
cheaper one, Hong Kong.
They're going to buy from Hong
Hong
Kong,
Kong.
naturally. They're going to buy from Hong Kong. So the Hong Kong supply price here we plot, the Taiwan supply price we plot. Under free trade, how many computers will Ecuador produce, import, and demand? Well, they're going to buy from the cheapest supplier. That's going to be Hong Kong. And so therefore, they're going to supply 5 computers. They're going to demand 85 computers, and they're going to import 80 computers from Hong Kong. There's your free trade equilibrium, price and quantity. So 5 PCs supplied, demand 85, imports are 80. Now, the book tells us that Hong Kong and Ecuador negotiate a voluntary export restraint, which is an export quota, behaves just like a quota of 40 PCs. What does that mean? And Taiwan is no longer going to export to Ecuador. So in this case, in this scenario, Taiwan is out of the picture. So they want to know the various welfare effects, the quota-induced price, the redistributed protective revenue, and consumption effects. Well, the quota is administered by Hong Kong. We know it's a voluntary export restraint. So Hong Kong exporters are going to capture the windfall profit or the quota rent, the revenue effect. So the VER adjusted supply curve, quota adjusted supply, is the domestic production plus the quota. So it's 5 plus 40. That puts us here at this point where this circle is, and we just draw our new quota adjusted supply curve.
Professor, the quota equal 5 is a given?
No, the quota is 40. We were told the quota is 40. It says Hong Kong imposes a VER, no. Ecuador and Hong Kong negotiate a voluntary export agreement in which Hong Kong imposes on its exporters a quota that limits shipments to Ecuador to 40 computers. So it's a VER of 40 PCs or 40 units. That plus the domestic supply gets you to 45, allows you to draw your adjusted supply curve. right? This gives you your voluntary export restraint or quota adjusted, your export quota adjusted supply curve. And we're able to draw our line straight through, intersecting with our price, gives us a quota induced price of $700. Very easy. Again, we're told we have a quota of 40. We can draw our quota adjusted supply curve. We're intersecting with our demand curve, draw a line across, gives us the price of $700. Yes? Now, so what does that mean? Well, we see here the domestic supply is going to increase from 5 to 25. Yes? Demand, you see demand here at 65. Well, the difference between the domestic production of 25 and overall demand of 65 has to equal the quota, which is the 40. So what's happened here? Domestic production increased from 5 to 25. Overall demand fell from 85 to 25. Why? Because the price went from $300 a unit to $700 a unit. And again, we see the difference between the domestic production and overall domestic demand is the quota of 40 units. So now in terms of our welfare effects, we can draw them very easily. We have our redistributive effect here, which we calculate out at $6,000. We have our protective effect here, which we calculate out at $4,000. You have your revenue effect here, which is $16,000. 40 units times 400 is your $16,000. And then finally, you have your consumption effect as a result of falling consumption of 2020 units. That costs you $4,000. So your consumer surplus has fallen by the full amount. A, B, C, D gives you $30,000 because your price increased from $300 to $700 a unit. Your overall welfare loss, excluding the transfer to produce a surplus, is your protective effect, your revenue effect, and your consumption effect gives you $24,000. So here we see a summary of all of your welfare effects and your overall welfare loss. Are there any questions here? Okay, so next we're told, assume again, I'm reading from the book, that Hong Kong imposed an export quota to its producers that restricts shipments to Ecuador to 40 computers. Taiwan, though, is a non-restrained exporter, is going to ship an additional 20 units. So if Taiwan is shipping an additional 20 units, well, then what does that mean? It means that the Taiwan supply price is going to hold. So if we know the Taiwan supply price is $500 a unit, well, we only have to draw a line straight across at $500 a unit, where we were at the beginning of the exercise when we plotted the Taiwan and Hong Kong supply price, to plot the welfare effects given that Taiwan is now selling into this protected market. And so what do we see? We see that domestic production increases from 5 units to 15 units, and overall consumption increases by another 60 units. What are those 60 units? It's the 40 units coming from Ecuador and the 20 units coming from Taiwan, gets you to 15 plus your 60 gets you to 75 here, which is your new demand, right? And so again, we were able to plot the redistributive effect, which is 2,000, your protective effect, 1,000, your revenue effect of 12,000, your consumption effect, your overall change in consumer surplus, which is ABCD at the Taiwan supply price of 16,000, and your overall welfare loss, which changes. Before it was 24,000 at the quota induced price of 700. Here at the price of 500, the overall welfare loss falls to 14,000. So the question here is, what's the overall change in welfare loss? Well, it's smaller by 10,000 once the Taiwanese are allowed to sell into this protected market. Once they're able to sell into the protected market as a non-restrained exporter. Okay. Any questions on that?
Yeah, I have a question. So is it?
Hey, James. Sure.
Hi, how are you, Professor?
I'm good.
Good. So is it only the Taiwanese price that is $500, or is the what happened to the quota price at $700?
Right.
I mean, why would you, if Taiwan can supply at $500, why would you keep a $700 quota induced price?
Well, in this case, what they're saying is that Ecuador is limited to 40 computers. They can sell 40 computers into the country, and that Taiwan can sell 20 computers into the country unrestrained. And we know that Taiwan can supply at unlimited by the quota. We know that Taiwan can supply at a $500 a unit price. In which case, what's going to happen? That's the price that's going to govern the situation here. And so at a price of $500 a unit, all I did was I drew a line straight across at $500. And what do we see? We see that the country's domestic production increased to 15 units. Overall consumption increases beyond that by another 60 units, getting us to 75 units. Just bear with me for a second there, James. Right. Ecuador is still exporting its 40 units, but Taiwan is exporting an additional 20 units into the market. And these are I'm looking at the question exactly. Determine the overall welfare loss to Ecuador as a result of the quota. In this case, as a result of the quota, the overall welfare loss falls by $10,000 because we've introduced unrestrained Taiwanese supply into the marketplace. In terms of how I would phrase this on an exam, I would phrase it probably a little differently. The question that you're asking is Ecuador still selling at $700 a unit into the Hong Kong market? Is that what you're asking?
Yes.
And my answer is no, they're not selling at that price anymore. Because once Taiwan is in the market, it means that the Ecuadorians are going to sell at that same price. They're going to sell $500 a unit also, right? So you've got Taiwan selling 20 units at $500 a unit, and you've got Ecuador selling another 40 units at $500 a unit. That's what you have.
Got it. Okay.
Okay. All right. You're welcome. Okay. So if we go over a minute or two or three, if you would bear with me, I appreciate that. Let's see if we can get through with this last question, which is an international price discrimination. So I plotted for you here the various curves, okay, that appear in the book. Okay, we're looking at the markets for toys in Canada and the United Kingdom. And what do we know? We know very simple. We know that in order to determine as a non-discriminating seller that how is the company going to maximize its profits? By producing and selling where its marginal revenue equals its marginal cost. So it's going to be selling 9 units at $5 a unit. Hold on. Selling 9 units at $5 a unit. Okay? We have to draw a line, horizontal line, $5 a unit to intersect the demand curves in each of the submarkets. We know that the average total cost here is $3 a unit, right? Gives you a profit of $2 a unit. But again, drawing our optimal output in each submarket to determine the optimal output, we're drawing a horizontal line to intersect the demand schedules at $5 a unit. So we know that in the UK, we're going to sell at $5 a unit, 7 units. And in Canada, we're going to sell at $5 a unit, 2 units. And so that gives us, they're selling 9 toys at $5 a unit for $45, an average total cost of $3 a unit, or $27. They're selling 7 toys at $5 a unit for $35, and 5 units, and 2 toys at $5 a unit for $10 gives us a total of $45 less the $27 gave us an $18 profit. Are there any questions on that? The key here is knowing is that the company is going to maximize or optimize its profit where marginal revenue equals marginal cost, and then drawing the vertical line to intersect the demand curve, and then drawing across in the various submarkets this horizontal line that intersects the price, that intersects the demand curve at exactly the same price in the overall market. Okay? Now the question is what happens if you're a discriminating seller? Well, as a price discriminating seller, they're going to maximize their profit by charging a higher price in a less elastic market, which is the UK, and a lower price in the more elastic market, which is Canada. How do we know that Canada is the more elastic market? You just have to look at the demand curve. The demand curve is more shallow. It's not as steep. The steeper demand curve in the UK means that it's less elastic. So here, we know that the optimal output and price is found where the horizontal lines can intersect the marginal revenue schedules in each one of those submarkets at $2 a share. It's where the marginal revenue intersects the marginal cost at $2 a unit, not $2 a share. So that gets us to our 9 and to our 5. In the UK, we see $2 a unit. We've drawn a line straight across at $2 a unit to intersect the marginal revenue schedule. Now we're going to draw a vertical line up to the demand curve. That gets us, we're selling 5 units at $7 a unit in the UK, and we're going to sell 4 units at $4 a unit in Canada. That means we're selling 35 plus 16 gets us 51, less 27 gives us a profit of 24, which, if I remember correctly, what was the profit before? The profit was $18 a unit. So now we've booked another $6 worth of profit by being a discriminating seller in those 2 markets. Okay? Any questions here? Your total profit is greater because you've managed to distinguish between the elasticity of demand in the 2 markets, and therefore you can charge a higher price in the less elastic market in the United Kingdom, and you make more money. Your change is $6 a unit, and
Professor, I have
that's
a
it.
question.
Yeah.
So it says that marginal revenue is equal to marginal costs. I'm just a little confused how you got that point.
Where? What point?
On the 3rd graph on the far right, marginal.
3rd graph on the far right. Right.
Marginal cost never touches marginal revenue.
Of course it does. This is marginal costs here, and that's intersecting
Oh,
marginal
I'm looking
revenue
at
right there.
I'm looking at ATC. Oh, never mind.
That's average total cost.
Yeah.
This is marginal revenue equals marginal cost here. That's exactly right. So that you see from the very beginning.
Sorry, no, I understand it. I was just reading the graph wrong. I thought the MC right
As a
side
price
was
discriminating
connected to
seller,
left
where
side.
you are now.
Yeah.
As a price discriminating seller, you're going to maximize profit here, where your marginal cost equals your marginal revenue, right?
Yeah, I just read the graph wrong.
Okay, that's fine. Okay, folks. So
Professor,
yeah. Hey, Fauza, what's up?
hi, Professor. So
Hi.
what's the importance of the average total cost here?
The importance of the average total cost is well, look, where average total costs.
I mean,
The average total cost is you're selling 9 units, 5 in the UK and 4 in Canada, at a total price. You're selling, your average total cost is $3 a unit, right? And that's 9 units times $3 is your cost is $27. Your revenue, your cost stays the same, whether you're a non-discriminating seller or a discriminating seller. What changes is your revenue. By distinguishing between the elasticity of demand, you can charge a higher price in one market as opposed to the other. You can book more revenue. Here you were able to book an additional $6 worth of profit. Do you understand now? Your average total cost is your cost.
yeah, thank you so much.
Cost and variable cost, right?
Pardon me?
Average cost is variable cost plus fixed cost. Right?
No, in other words, the point we made up here, we talked about dumping. As long as you can cover your average variable costs, you're good. In other words, you don't need to sell your average total cost. as long as you're selling at your average variable cost, anything above that is going to contribute to average total cost, which is where international price discrimination comes into play. If you can distinguish between elasticity of demand in two different markets, where you can sell lower price abroad than you're selling at home, as long as it's over your ABC, you can still contribute to average total cost. In this case, what we're saying is, what is your total cost? Your total cost is $3 a unit, which gives you, if you're selling 9 units, $27. What differs between the scenario under non-price discrimination versus price discrimination is the revenue that you're able to book, depending upon the price discrepancies in the two markets. Okay?
I see. Thank you.
You're welcome. So you're going to see questions on Wednesday's exam that look exactly like the homework we did tonight. And my expectation is we did with the midterm, is that you'll take the exam without notes or the aid of other material, and that you should all do fine. I like to think that the quiz is a very narrow set of information that you need to, is a very narrow set of data that you need to deliver on. And so if you were dissatisfied with your midterm grade, this is an opportunity to really pick up a lot of points going into the last section of the course, into the final exam that we'll see in the better part of a month. That said, the exam on Wednesday will be 3 questions, much like you saw tonight, with multiple parts. I will email you Wednesday morning with regard to any instructions, but that the exam will begin much as it did with the midterm, with a link appearing on Blackboard at 7:30. You'll have an hour for the quiz, and we're gonna take off those last 15 minutes rather than start a new material on regional trading relationships. For next week, though, for Monday, you should have read Chapter 8 on regional trading relationships, a short chapter. We'll be talking about some very interesting things. Naturally, we're plotting the welfare effects of regional trading relationships like the European Union, and that's all very interesting. If any questions come up between now and Wednesday, you're welcome to ask. I have a couple of emails I'm a bit delayed on getting back to. I will over the course of the next number of days. I've been traveling a bit, so I apologize for any delay. But if there are any questions with regard to homework or specifically about material for the quiz, don't hesitate to contact me. I'll get back to you quickly. Broader questions I have not gotten to quite yet. I have a few to respond to. But again, thank you all very much for a good evening. I see that I've gone over my time. I'm going to let you go. I see I'm 5 minutes over.
First, please.
Yeah.
When will you post this? If I wanted to go over the 3 corrections again tonight.
I'm going to post this. I'm going to post everything tonight within the next hour.
Perfect.
Okay. And again, thank you all for your patience this evening. I apologize for imposing on extra time. But again, thank you. Have a good evening, a safe continuation of your day, and I look forward to seeing you all next Monday. Okay, good luck on the quiz. All right,
Professor.
Thank you.
Yep. Good night, everybody. Thank you.
I had one question.
Hey, what's up? Sure.